Now let's bring in tonight's panel. Joining me, Labor MP Andrew Charlton and National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie, both in Canberra. So great to have you both with us tonight. Look, let's start with the big news today that the country's inflation has risen to 6.8% in April, higher than expected. Andrew, the budget forecasts the budget forecasts still have inflation returning to 3.25% by 2023 to 24, and then the target inflation rate the following year. But these forecasts now are looking ambitious, potentially, given today's data. What do you think?
Well, you're right that the headline inflation number was larger than expected. But the good news was that the underlying inflation number, which is the inflation number that draws out volatile items like food and energy costs, was actually lower than it was last month. So we are seeing, in terms of core inflation, the inflation that the RBA focuses on, we are seeing that come down. And that is good news for households who want to see grocery prices stop rising and want to see less pressure on the RBA to raise rates. That's good news for them, and that was the positive story out of today's inflation numbers.
Bridget, Philip Lowe said today in estimates that the budget wasn't inflationary. You've argued in the opposition that it is inflationary. Do you think he's right?
Well, I think Governor Lowe made a couple of key points today. He did say the budget in its overall, if you saw it as a totality, was neutral when it came to inflation. He didn't say it put downward pressure on inflation, which is what we've been arguing for. But he made it very, very clear that he has grave concerns for our productivity growth rates at the moment, and that we are not being productive enough, and that is going to have significant consequences, particularly on rental price increases going forward. He's forecast today that rent will be going from 4.9, will go to 10% increases, which we haven't seen for a very, very long time. And he also made the point that putting downward pressure on aggregate demand was a key role for the RBA, and they're doing everything they can to make that happen. The government's plans to bring additional new arrivals to the country without requisite capital investment into both housing and infrastructure to match that increase in population was also concern for Governor Lowe in his evidence today to estimates.
Yeah, Andrew, the governor did make that point that we haven't had productivity growth in 3 years, and he said that if the wages growth of around 4% continued, that would be an issue if there isn't productivity growth. So doesn't the government need to be doing more here on this front?
It absolutely does. But just on the point that Bridget made, there is no connection between productivity growth and rents. That's a completely spurious connection. They're two separate points. The governor did say that there has been low productivity growth in Australia over the last 3 years, and that is true, and that is something that should concern all Australians, because productivity growth is the ultimate driver of our long-term living standards growth. Secondly, the governor talked about the rental crisis that we have in Australia and made the point that the way to address that rental crisis is to build more houses. And that's why it is such a shame that the Liberal Party and the Greens in the Senate are blocking the government's proposal to build tens of thousands of more houses, which the governor has said is the only way to address the rental crisis over the long term.
But what about on that productivity question? What can the government be doing to lift productivity? What are you going to do?
Well, the government has outlined a range of different productivity boosting measures that include efforts to improve the skills across the Australian economy. A more productive workforce and a better educated workforce is a workforce that is more productive over the long term and contributes to economic productivity growth. We're also investing in infrastructure to address some of the supply chain bottlenecks and other issues in our economy, also a driver of productivity growth. And we're looking at competition policy to make sure our economy is as dynamic and as competitive as possible. Those are the three main drivers of productivity growth, and the government has a strong agenda in each of them.
I have to disagree, Sharri, as the Shadow Infrastructure Minister. This year alone, the government's cut $5.5 billion from infrastructure investment across the country, and they've put into a review potentially billions of dollars of infrastructure projects right across the country, critical road and rail projects, I might add, that are absolutely designed to boost productivity and make sure that we get people and products where they need to go in the most efficient manner. And just to pick up on another point from Andrew, the Productivity Commission did its 5-yearly review into how we can, as a nation, increase productivity across a whole raft of government areas, including infrastructure and transport, over 70 recommendations. And that was handed down prior to the budget, and the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, poo-pooed it and basically put it in the bottom drawer, never to be seen again. And they were things like road user charges in my own area of transport and how do we invest in targeted infrastructure.